Okay, this is video number 2 of the inflation and prices module. And in this video, we're going to be going through the causes of inflation. I changed my outline a little bit. And then we're going to go through something called the equation of exchange. It's just an equation, it's a tautology, it's just something that always holds true. However, it leads to something called the quantity theory, which is a theory about inflation that was Irving Fisher is the name associated with the quantity theory. He came up with it. And then we'll go through money neutrality, what money neutrality means, and is it true or false? Is it true or false in the short run and true or false in the long run? Okay, causes of inflation. A famous economist, Milton Friedman, who got the Nobel Prize in economics and is often thought of as the father of monetary theory. He said, this is a quote from him, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That means it has to do with money. And not necessarily paper money. Doesn't have to be paper. When the New World, North and South America were discovered, people at that time in Europe were using gold and silver as their currency for trading. They came over here, found these lands, and stole a whole lot of gold and silver and brought it back to Europe. Guess what happened to prices in Europe when they brought all that gold and silver back? Prices went up. They were using gold and silver as their money, and when that money supply increased, prices went up. Now you can also think of it this way: supply and demand for gold or supply and demand for silver. The price, the quantity, the supply of gold goes up. The new equilibrium is a lower price for gold. The supply of silver goes up, the equilibrium price falls. So you can think of it in terms of the prices of everything went up in terms of gold, or you can think of it as in terms of the pricing silver and gold went down in terms of everything else. Now let me show you what Milton Friedman did. Friedman wrote a book, and in the 70s there was quite a bit of inflation in this country and around the world too. It's funny how it's not just one country like the US experiencing deflation or inflation. Other countries, the developed countries, are experiencing the exact same problems. So the US had a real inflation problem, inflation 10 or 11% or 12, something like that. It got into the double digits. And so Friedman wrote his book, and he showed these graphs. And this is the United States from 1964 to 1977. So a relatively short period of time, 13 years. And the solid line is the quantity of money. And the dotted line is the consumer price index, which we'll go through shortly. That represents, it's an index to show how what prices are doing. And you can see a very close correlation between these two lines. As the quantity of money increased, prices went up. And Friedman didn't do that for just the United States. Here's Germany. Same type of graph, same time period. Quantity of money on one and the consumer prices on the other, highly correlated. Here's UK, same two graphs, same relationship. Here's Japan, same two graphs, same relationship. Now, just because the two variables are associated or correlated doesn't mean cause and effect. But eventually, with some other fancy econometric techniques, they were able to show later that yes, indeed, there is a cause and effect, and it runs from money to prices. So a change in the money supply does affect the price level. The last one here is my favorite. This is Brazil. And you can see it's a log scale. It goes from 0 to 350. And you can see the close correlation between money and prices. That means that in 1964, something that cost about $10, 13 years later cost $350. So they were having quite a bit of inflation and also a big increase in their money supply also. Now, Friedman brought back a model that had gone out of favor. It was a model called the quantity theory, developed by Irving Fisher. But to understand this model that Friedman brought back, the quantity theory, first we have to understand the equation of exchange, which is very similar, except that it's not a theory. It's just a mathematical identity that was converted to a theory later on. So this is a mathematical identity. And this came out somewhere around around 1850. So it's a concept that's pretty old. And it goes like this. The amount of money spent should be equal to the total sales of output in the economy. So the amount of money that is spent should be equal to the total sales of output in the economy. And the total sales of output in the economy is nominal GDP. So now this has to hold true. We can write the amount of money spent as M, which is the total amount of money. So M is the amount of money times the velocity of money. V is the velocity, also known as the turnover of money, which is the number of times money is used in a year. So you buy something for $1 from somebody, and they take that dollar and they buy something else from somebody else, and that person takes that same dollar and spends it on something from somebody else. That same dollar is used over and over again to buy things. So we look at, well, how many times does a dollar get spent in a year? That's the velocity. So we take the total amount of money times how many times that money is spent during the year, and that has got to be equal to nominal GDP, which is the output in the economy, the real output. Y is the real output times the price level. P is the price level. So P times Y is nominal GDP. And that's got to be equal to the total amount of money spent, which is M times B. I'm going to rewrite this as M dot B. Make sure that's clear, that that's a V. So, for example, Let's say that the total amount produced in the economy is 1,000 oranges. I'm going to write this in orange. 1,000 oranges. That's a total real GDP. And we're going to say the price of an orange is $1. Therefore, nominal GDP would be $1,000. And let's say there's $200 floating around this economy that's been created. That means that the velocity then is 5, because we've got to have it so that the total amount of money spent equals the total sales. And that velocity is a calculated number. So the government publishes that information. And the way they do it is because they know how much money is floating around, and they know what nominal GDP is, and they can calculate the velocity. Now, suppose M, the money supply, doubles. Put that in purple. Suppose M increases to 400. Something's going to have to change. Either the velocity is going to fall, or prices are going to have to go up, or output's going to go up. So if prices don't change and output doesn't change, that means velocity would have to fall to 2.5. That's one possibility. Or maybe output will double. The Y will double. Or maybe prices will double. But something has to change so that this equation is in balance. Now, Irving Fisher took this equation of exchange and turned it into a theory. So this is a very old theory, by the way. This is like 1911. And this is Irving Fisher, who is a famous economist. And this theory comes in and out of favor. It's in favor for a while, and then it's kind of rejected, then it comes back and gets rejected again. Friedman revised it, it's been rejected again. We take the equation of exchange, M times V equals P times Y, price times output, and if big if, V is constant and Y is constant, as I said, that's a very big if, then we can write this as M times V, M times V equals P times Y, and we'll hold, put a little bar over Y. I mean, it's no longer a variable, it's just a constant. And a little bar over V means we're going to hold that constant too. So now we can write this as M equals Y bar over V bar times P. Now, if V is constant and Y is constant, then Y over V is a constant. And we'll write that constant, Y bar over V bar, as little k. So now we'll write this as M equals little k, which is a constant, times P. And what this means is that any change that comes about in M changes the price level by the exact same percentage. So if M goes up 10%, P goes up 10%. If M doubles, P doubles. M triples, P triples. because we're holding output and velocity constant. So you can try this for yourself to see how well this works. Let's say that V is, let's say V is 5, like up above, and Y is 1,000. Well, Y over V would be 1,000 over 5, which is 200. So if we have an M of 200, so now we would have M of 200 would be equal to 200 times P. P then would have to be 1, like we had originally. Price level was 1 at the money supply of 200. Now, if we double the money supply to be 400, then we'll have K, which is 200, times P. P then has to be 2. So P is 2. So you can see what's happening there. Money supply goes up from 200 to 400, doubles. The price level goes from 1 to 2. It also doubles. And put any numbers you want in there for velocity and K. Try this out yourself, and you'll see that there's this proportional relationship between the money supply and prices. So how well does the quantity theory work? These are empirical tests. Look at the data to see how it works. Well, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Over the long haul, it probably holds up. The last 25 to 30 years, it has not held up. It's broken down, that relationship. For the last 30 years or so, there's just been no good relationship between the money supply and prices. In the long run, it probably holds up, but it has not been holding up lately. And the reason why, we'll say, not holding up well. Up well. Over last 30 years or so. One reason is velocity is not constant. Now, when Irving Fisher came up with this model, he didn't have any data to look at velocity, but now we do. We can look at it and say, clearly, it is not stable. Now, just to show you a graph of, say, over the last 50 or 60 years, what's been going on with velocity. Take a look here. There's a lot of things that determine velocity, and it's anything but constant. You can see down here in the late 50s was around 3.5, and then up around 2010, it was close to 11, and then it was falling after that. So this velocity is changing. So that ruins the relationship then between the money supply and inflation. Now in 2008, there were some big increases in the money supply. I mean, in 2010, 10, 11, and 12, big increases in the money supply. People were concerned about inflation. It never showed up. Well, one of the reasons is that velocity dropped by enough to prevent the prices from going up. So just because there's some money supply that's increasing doesn't automatically mean there's inflation. Normally, inflation will show up about a year, year and a half later after the money supply is increased. But if the velocity is dropping, then it's not going to show up as inflation. Okay, last topic on this video is something called money neutrality. And the quantity theory is an example of money neutrality. Money neutrality means that money is neutral on the economy. That it only affects prices. So an increase in money or decrease in the money supply will just affect the price level in the economy. It'll affect nominal prices, it affects nominal GDP, but it won't affect real GDP. So money will be neutral as far as affecting the economy. It won't make real GDP go up. It won't make the unemployment rate go down. It'll only affect prices. Economists 100 years ago believed in this idea of money neutrality, that it doesn't matter how much money is produced. All it will do is change prices in the economy, but nothing else. Now economists believe that's not true. Very definitely not true, at least in the short run. So now economists know, since about mid-1940s, that money neutrality is not true in the short run, whatever the short run is. However, it is probably true in the long run. So money neutrality is true in the long run. So the belief is, yeah, you increase the money supply. In the long run, the only thing that's going to happen is that prices will go up. But in the short run, economists know that changing the money supply really does affect the economy. It does affect real GDP. It does affect the business cycle. Increasing the money supply can stimulate the economy. Decreasing the money supply can cause a recession or depression. And that's what happened in the 1930s. There was a big decrease in the money supply that caused a depression. Now, before we go, there's just one more graph that I'd like to show you. And this is, let's see here. This is a graph of the growth of the money supply in the United States and the inflation rate in the United States. So this is something that economists look at to see how money affects the inflation rate. And each one of these green points is a decade, 10 years in the United States. So if we were to draw a best fit line through this, we draw something maybe like this. And it does look like, since this graph goes back to 1870s, it does look like there's this relationship, a positive relationship between the growth of the money supply and the inflation rate. The more money there is, the higher inflation that there is. So over the long run, it does look like the quantity theory holds. Increase the money supply, it increases the inflation rate. However, take a look at two of the points on here. Let's see, here is the 2000s. So this is that point there. And here's the 1990s. So for that 20-year period, it's kind of flat. This is when the quantity theory broke down. And so for the last 30 or 40 years, if we were to measure the growth of the money supply on one axis and inflation rate on the other, we're not going to find any correlation whatsoever between them, unfortunately. Okay, so in this video, we went through the causes of inflation. And for the most part, the causes of inflation is money. And then we went through the equation of exchange, which is just a tautology that always has to hold true. Very simple. Irving Fisher took that equation of exchange, that tautology, and turned it into a theory, the quantity theory. And the only thing that he did, he just held velocity constant and output constant, and then made a theory out of it. Now we know output isn't constant. That adjusts from year to year. Real output increases in this country 2% a year or 3% a year. And velocity certainly isn't constant either. That goes up and down. And there's probably a relationship between the money supply and velocity, because velocity may depend on interest rates. When interest rates are low, people tend to keep more cash on hand because the opportunity cost of holding cash is pretty low. And when the money supply changes, it affects interest rates. So there's this relationship between money supply and the velocity. When the money supply goes up, the velocity tends to fall for a little while. Then we went through this idea of money neutrality, which is that money doesn't have any effect on the economy, the real economy, real GDP, real prices, unemployment. But now we know that that's not true. Change in the money supply definitely affects the economy. It does affect real GDP. It does affect the business cycle. It does affect where we are in relation to the PPF.